They are not sure what it is. And here are some nests. And this lesion would be called by a pathologist severely dysplastic. Now, what to do now? They use this word to express a gray zone, but it's already, again, a diagnostic gray zone and not a biologic gray zone. Why? Because I show you now the clinical image of this lesion. This is the clinical image of this lesion. This is the close-up of this lesion. And this is dermatoscopy of this lesion. What's your diagnosis? Melanoma. Are you sure? Yes. And I'm also sure that this lesion histopathologically is a melanoma, although it was diagnosed as severely dysplastic nevus. So how to treat severely dysplastic nevi? You can treat it like melanoma because it tells you, yeah? The pathologist is not sure. But what does it mean when they call it mildly dysplastic or moderately dysplastic? It means nothing. Yeah? It means nothing. This is the only gray zone. Yeah? The gray zone is in the head of the pathologist or in our heads. There is no gray zone in biology. But it's getting worse. We see a morphologic continuum, and we also assume that there is an evolution that is the same as saying that this dysplastic nevus is a precursor of melanoma. Why? Because it looks more ugly than a typical nevus. This is another mistake. So we assume that this evolution starts with benign nevi that look completely typical. Then there are atypical or dysplastic nevi that look more atypical. And these nevi are more likely to become a melanoma than typical nevi. This is the meaning of dysplastic, isn't it? At least sometimes we assume that. If this is true, then this is, for example, from the history. This is also what the others thought 60 years ago. What we see here is an obvious melanoma on this patient, and this is the obvious melanoma some years ago, and this is the obvious melanoma even some years earlier. You agree with me with this interpretation? Now let's look what they told us 40 years ago. They said A, senile lentigo, 2 months duration, B, pre-malignant stage, 18 years duration, and C, with area of malignant degeneration. You know what the mistake is? They didn't know how to diagnose melanoma in its flat stage, and so they assumed it was a precursor lesion. So they did a mistake then that we would not do at the moment. But this is the basis of the biologic concept and this is not fantasy, this was published in the New England Journal 2002, that we start with a benign nevus, then with a dysplastic nevus that is a precursor, and then we have from the dysplastic nevus a melanoma. If this is true, we should be able to predict from the morphology the chance that the lesion develops into melanoma. Now, can we predict the chance of a malignant transformation of a nevus by morphology? First of all, most melanomas develop de novo, not in a nevus. But if the concept of the dysplastic nevus as a precursor is true, we should be able to predict by morphology which nevus will develop into melanoma or not. If we cannot predict it, then the term dysplastic nevus would be nonsense. Now, this is a melanoma that developed in a nevus. I know that because I saw the histopathology, and here is a close-up. Yeah? Now, I show you 5 nevi of the same patient, and one of the nevi is the precursor of this melanoma. And now you tell me which of the nevi is the precursor of this melanoma. Is it this lesion? Is it this lesion? Is it this lesion? Is it this lesion? Or is it this lesion? So, who votes for left upper? Just pick the red card and vote. One. Who picks right upper lesion? 2. Come on, you cannot lose anything. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Who is for the middle lesion, that is the precursor of the melanoma? 2 or 3. Who is for the left lower lesion and the right lower lesion? Who has no opinion because... So you didn't vote because maybe you don't know which lesion developed into melanoma, and now you should see the solution. It's the left upper lesion. Now, what was the mistake you made? Can we predict the chance of malignant transformation of a nevus by morphology? No, we can't. What was the mistake you made? You substituted a difficult question, which lesion will develop into a melanoma, with a simple question. What is the simple question? Which lesion is the most ugly lesion? Which lesion is the most ugly lesion? Maybe this one, maybe this one. But this was not the question. So the truth is, you cannot predict malignant transformation by morphology. If melanomas develop in a nevus, they usually develop in a nevus that looks completely inconspicuous. For example, another example, this is a melanoma that developed in a nevus, and you see the lesion doesn't look dysplastic at all. Dysplasia doesn't predict malignancy. Can we predict it by pathology if we cannot predict it by dermatoscopy or by clinical examination? Now, where are the pathologists? Which one is the most atypical lesion? Is it lesion number 1? Lesion number 2? Lesion number 3? Or lesion number 4? Which one is the most atypical? Well, in one of these lesions did a melanoma develop, and you cannot tell in which lesion. It was lesion number 1, and you see it here. Here's the melanoma in the nevus, and if you cut it here, you see a nevus that Jerry, when I asked him, called this would be a very typical nevus, not dysplastic at all. You see, if also a melanoma develops in this nevus, it must not develop in a dysplastic nevus. Most often, it develops in a completely inconspicuous nevus and not in a dysplastic nevus. And here you see the melanoma, obviously, that developed in a completely inconspicuous, non-dysplastic nevus. Now, the last 3 minutes about atypical Spitz tumors. Well, it started all in 1948 with Sophie Spitz, and she thought that these lesions were melanomas actually and not nevi, because she thought that the morphology, this cytologic morphology of these nevi is very atypical, like in a melanoma. And she thought that these lesions were melanomas, not nevi. And this problem exists until today. Here we have a lesion clinically, dermatoscopically, it looks a little bit asymmetric, and histopathologically it's also difficult. And here there are large cells, and you might call this Spitz nevus, atypical Spitz nevus, or even spitzoid melanomas. You need to look at it for a longer time. And the problem is now here we have also a gray zone, and this gray zone is termed atypical Spitz tumor. What does it mean again? It does not mean again that there is a biologic uncertainty. It again means that the pathologist is not sure what it is. Is it a nevus or is it a melanoma? He doesn't know, or she doesn't know, and now she calls it atypical Spitz tumor. The problem is that the gray zone, again, is a morphologic gray zone and not a biologic one. And again, those who speak of gray zones, they usually confuse morphology with biology. And all these acronyms, STUMP, Spitz tumor with uncertain malignant potential, MELTUMP, melanocytic tumor of uncertain malignant potential, or SEMPUS, can be summarized in another name. I call them DWAM, yeah? Diagnosis without any meaning, yeah? Because they don't mean anything, yeah? Yeah? Biology is good or it is bad. We cannot predict biology sometimes by morphology, because morphology is a continuum. And the only way to diagnose melanocytic lesion is by saying, I'm sure it's good, benign and nevus, I'm sure it's bad, it's a melanoma, or I don't know, and nothing in between. Well, I don't know is in between. Now, even those who think that morphology or melanocytic lesions are a continuum between good and bad will have to admit that when you come to decide what to do with a patient, there are only 2 options. There are not 3 or 4 options. You have to decide, treat it as a nevus or treat it as a melanoma. So the question is what to do with terms like SEMPUS, MELTUMP, or STUMP. For who will benefit from these terms? Is it the pathologist? Is it the clinician? Or is it the patient? Well, I say the only one who has a benefit from this term is the pathologist. Why?